acknowledgement. Since this program is about cultural resources, I wanted to read our a little bit more detailed land acknowledgement. We're the land steward program, so we definitely want to acknowledge the original land stewards. And our OSU Southern Oregon Research and Extension Center near Medford, Oregon, is located within the homelands of the Takelma people. Takelma means those along the river, and their traditional land is along the Rogue River and its tributaries, including seasonal communities along Jackson Creek on the site of the present-day SOREC. The Takelma were displaced during rapid Euro-American colonization and armed conflict during 1852 to 1856. Survivors were forcibly removed to the central Oregon coast and Willamette Valley. Today, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians identify their members as living descendants of the Takelma. And if you would, wherever we are on native land, and if you would like to learn more about native land where you are, this is one way to start exploring those, and I'll try to drop that link in the chat here in a moment. So we'll be recording the presentation tonight, and if you are a registrant, you'll get a recording link, and after a bit, we'll put it up on our YouTube channel as well. If you need closed captions, you can control that through the Zoom controls at the bottom bar. And so this presentation is part of our OSU Land Steward Program's Community Education Series. We put this series of classes and presentations together. They're open to anyone. You don't have to be a land steward, and they're put together with a team of volunteers from our program. We have Marcy Kaminker tonight with us. She's our committee chair, and she'll be taking over in case I would have any technical issues. If you want to hear about upcoming classes, you can visit our website just by Googling OSU Land Steward Program, get to our homepage and click the subscribe button, and that will get you emails about upcoming events, and that's all that comes over that email list. So upcoming classes that we have tonight, Managing Cultural Resources on Your Property. And January 23rd, we have Launching a Neighborhood Climate Club. And February 21st, we have Trail Building, the Basics of Siting, Design, and Construction. So those are all things you could register for if you wanted to. And tonight, we have a really special program about managing cultural resources on your property. So what to do if you come across things. So, and we have four panelists with us this evening. I'm very excited to learn from these folks. Chelsea Rose is a historical archaeologist who focuses on the settlement and development of the American West. She directs the Southern Oregon University Laboratory of Anthropology and serves as a principal investigator in the award-winning Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project. Rose regularly works with the media, students, and community volunteers to promote archaeological awareness and encourage historical stewardship. John Pouley, Oregon archaeologist with the State Historic Preservation Office, has experience in the Arctic, Great Basin, and the Northwest, including studies of Northwest tribal pre-contact in the Columbia Plateau. He nominates archaeological sites and districts to the National Register of Historic Places, publishes in peer-reviewed journals, and gives presentations at archaeological conferences. Reese Edwards, as manager for historic preservation for the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, advocates for cultural resources significant to the tribe through 3 programs: collections, cultural protection, and archaeology. The tribe provides outreach and coordination with state and federal agencies, as well as coordinating projects such as recording and curating artifacts relevant to the history of the tribe. And we have a 4th person with us this evening, too many for one slide. Peter Hatch is an enrolled member of the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians, as well as staff history and archaeological specialist in the tribe's cultural programs department. He has worked for CTSI since 2013 and had a lifelong love of learning about and connecting to others to the deep histories of indigenous Oregon. He also serves as secretary of the Ilaka, hopefully I'm saying that right, Peter, you can correct me on that, Alliance, a nonprofit working to restore sea otters to their ancestral range on the Oregon coast. Okay, I'm excited to learn from these folks. And the way we're going to work our panel this evening, Chelsea, I'll be spotlighting our presenters, and Chelsea is going to kind of moderate our panel since she works in this field. I'll be fielding questions if you put them into the chat. And with that, I will turn it over to John, who I think has some slides to begin.
Well, first, maybe we'll go through and introduce or give a little bit more information about ourselves and kind of how we ended up coming to be on this panel, if that works.
Perfect. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay.
Thanks. Yes.
Good.
That's great.
Good. So I'm Chelsea Rose. I work at Southern Oregon University. Some of you might have worked with us or know me from around the Valley. And I'm really excited that Alan reached out a while back about putting together this program tonight, because this is something that comes up a lot. It's a really confusing thing for folks that have properties, especially where we work most commonly is Jacksonville, which is a national landmark. And so, the whole town is a cultural resource. And so I think this is a really exciting opportunity for us to access these three very knowledgeable experts in the field and to help us learn how to better navigate this process. I am not on the regulatory side of it, where I come in and SULA, the Southern Oregon University Laboratory of Anthropology, or SULA, where we come in is we are hired by cities, private landowners, federal, state, local agencies to help them comply with these regulatory procedures. So that's kind of where we come in. So because I've worked on kind of the other side of this, I'm just going to help moderate through this as we talk to our experts. And then please, if you do have questions, put them in the chat. And we'll hopefully get to everybody's, what everybody needs to know, or at least a good starting point to learning about how to best manage your sites and the cultural resources on your property. So we can just go through. John, if you want to give a little bit more context to why you are here.
Yeah, sure. My name is John Pouley. I'm the state archaeologist at the State Historic Preservation Office. I'm actually the fourth state archaeologist for Oregon since 1976. At the State Historic Preservation Office, most of what we do is regulatory. We're reviewing agencies' work and things like that. State agencies, private contractors. We try and help folks understand laws and processes and things like that. A lot of that stuff in the bio that was just shown is stuff I did in my former life as an archaeologist. So now I have more of a desk job, but I do still enjoy doing those things if I can. I just don't seem to be able to find the time these days. And I also wanted to call out, I love the photo that was used with the brush and the biface, because that's an excavation I did about 6 years ago with support from Brice at Grand Ronde, and also with Robert Kenta at Celette, who's one of the folks that Peter used to work with, one of his colleagues. That's the word I'm looking for. But I'll talk a little bit more about laws and stuff when I get my chance. But if I'll just to plug that, if you want to learn more about that biface cache site, a great way to find it is to Google Oregon math teacher finds biface cache or something like that. And I think that'll get you where you need to go.
Yeah, that's definitely a very good story of a happy ending of a collaboration with a private landowner and the State Historic Preservation Office. Peter, do you want to go next? And also I wanted to plug the intro mentioned Peter's work with sea otters, and you can read a bunch of wonderful articles about that in the latest issue of the Oregon Historical Quarterly. So a little plug for that too. Okay, Peter.
All right. Thank you so much, Chelsea, and good to be with you all here this evening. So, my name is Peter Celeste Hatch, or Peter Black Bear Hatch. I'm a tribal member, and I just got interested in taking some basic archaeology courses back in college, and one thing leads to another, and here I am today. Brice's introduction described their department structure and kind of the wide variety of things that tribal culture departments in general tend to deal with. It's everything from the regulatory side and federal agencies all the way to like individual researcher requests or requests for collaboration on various kinds of projects across, the fields of history, anthropology, archaeology, etc. all the way to random and sometimes very strange questions from the general public and even fellow tribal members, curating the collections of ancestral objects that make up a part of the way that we connect tribal members to contemporary cultural expression and revitalization. Not to mention working with, as it's become, I think increasingly interesting, a wide variety of private and nonprofit landowners figuring out how to incorporate a real sense of tonight we're going to be talking about cultural resources as they exist under the law, and where we're basically talking about archaeology. But tribal communities tend to bring a broader view about what it takes to perpetuate and maintain forever, as in our case the tribal constitution calls us to do, our identity as tribal people, and how that requires a balance and availability of for instance, all of the native plants that our lifeways rely upon, and helping encourage that across a wide variety of different landowners, partners, and projects. So that is to say that even for better staffed departments like my colleagues over at Grand Ronde, we are small teams spread thin, who do a lot. And I don't mean to pre-introduce Brice, but I hope that we'll be able to make this a discussion and bounce across those wide variety of topics depending on how what the audience is interested in this evening. So with that, I want to thank you for the time. Glad to be here.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, and speaking of their well-funded department over there with Brice, a bunch of SOU students went up to visit their archaeology lab, and they said it was cooler than our lab. So we have to obviously up our game a little bit to catch up with them, but not a competition. Brice, take it away. You're muted. You're muted. Brice is dealing with a little technical creativity to make this work for him. So thanks for bearing with us.
Yeah, and thank you all for those kind words. Keep telling my bosses. I've got 9 of them that have offices down the road. Yeah, I guess, thank you so much, Peter. And I can't stress how great it is to be able to partner with selects on many things, where shared interest, shared concerns, and shared area. That's such an important point that I think sometimes gets lost, and I'm glad everybody here actually gets to experience what that can look like here just in the intros alone. So I'm here in my official capacity with the tribe. I'm an archaeologist by background, which means way too long in school to learn how to dig square holes and take really detailed notes. And now I'm a bureaucrat, which means I've transitioned out of the getting to take walks in the woods and enjoy a landscape to sitting and working with a lot of legislative compliance and regulatory language sets, and work with state, federal, and private partners in how do we see and understand the laws and the CFRs and the other regulations out there for identification and recording and protection of resources, and how do we work with each other in carrying people through a process when they encounter these cultural resources out on the landscape. And Peter was starting to, I think, bring up that internally within the tribal community, that those resources go beyond stone objects or those materials that we can trace very far back into the past, but actually those places where cultural practices occurred, where first foods have been maintained or basketry materials have been maintained. So you'll hear more from me about people, place, and practice as I talk more, and I really look forward to this being a great conversation and with each other. I will share, I really enjoy working with the other three people on camera here. It's always a great opportunity when we get to share a space and have good conversation and share what we know and also learn from each other. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Chelsea. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great. Yeah, so without further ado, the way that we kind of structure this is it's going to be pretty informal, and we're going to kind of just have it be a conversation and go where it takes us throughout the evening. But we wanted to start with some nuts and bolts. And so John, because this is really his wheelhouse as the state archaeologist, so he is kind of the gatekeeper for lots of things that happen in the state, for better or for worse, from his perspective, I guess. But so he is going to start out with some slides that's just going to present some of the legislation, laws, rules, regulations that we're referencing when we talk about these processes for identifying or managing or dealing with cultural resources that may be encountered on your project, on your properties, or with your projects. So John, you want to take it away?
Remember to unmute. All right. Can folks see that? Is it showing?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Well, I already introduced myself, so yeah, I'm pretty much gonna go over federal laws and state laws, and I'm really going over like the main federal law, which is the National Historic Preservation Act. But there are many others, and I'm sure we'll have more conversations about those as is needed. But and then there are also Oregon revised statutes, and as Peter mentioned, a lot of those are very specific to archaeological sites. We're trying to at SHPO. First of all, we don't make laws at SHPO, so the laws that are made are like delegated to us as, okay, do this now or make sure this works, and that's fine. But there's a distinction between the federal law and the state law, and that is what constitutes a historic property in the federal law, which can be an archaeological site, but it can also be a property of religious and cultural significance to an Indian tribe, which is a term that is pulled right out of another federal law, which is the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which is also important for tribal sovereignty because it's basically there's kind of a bad history with tribes and not being able to practice their religion for a while, and then that was corrected with that law. But other types of properties and districts, things like that can include landscapes, areas associated with stories, and all that. So there's a distinction between our state laws and the federal laws. And all I'm going to say about that is at SHPO, we're trying to update a lot of our guidelines to be more culturally sensitive, more inclusive with groups. It used to be an archaeologist would go out and they would have to assess whether something was significant, and if it was determined not significant by then, the site could be destroyed, and that's not very culturally sensitive or inclusive. And so we're trying to stress to the archaeologists doing work the huge responsibility they have for talking about places. Brees, I loved what he said, people, places, and practice. Archaeologists talking about those things, it's a huge responsibility because the impacts of their decisions on those places can affect them, and they have to involve descendant communities in that process. So that's one of the things we're trying to stress here. Now, I hope I don't put everybody to sleep, because I'm going to talk about laws for a little bit. But like I said, the main one is the National Historic Preservation Act. It was signed by President Johnson in 1966. I am pretty certain this photo is not of him signing that document, but I found a photo online of him signing something, and I thought I could use it for my slide here. But what's interesting about the National Historic Preservation Act is there are various sections that we work with, not all of them, but there are certain ones that specifically either identify a role for a SHPO or identify a process that we have a role in that tribes also have roles in. So in section 101, it includes a process for approving a state historic preservation office. And not only that, it defines the role and the responsibilities of the SHPO. So this is a section where you can learn a little bit about the genesis of SHPOs. And this is one that I go look at quite often, because sometimes, to be honest, if I feel the SHPO is veering away from this, I like to remind folks of what our responsibilities are. And one of those, what not a responsibility for us, but there is a process for SHPOs to be reviewed, basically to be audited and held accountable. So if we're not doing our job, if we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing, because we get federal funding to administer this law at the state level, we have to make sure that we're doing it correctly. And so every year we have to submit, materials to kind of support what we're doing. One of the qualifications is that the SHPO must have folks that meet professional qualifications that are defined by the Secretary of the Interior on their staff. And I'm occupy one of those positions where that's applicable. I won't bore you with what those SOI qualifications are, but they're easily looked up on the web. But it's basically, like Bree said, spending a lot of time in school and then some experience after that and things like that. And I already said that part about implementing the law. One of the things we also do according to section 101 is that we're required to maintain a comprehensive inventory of historic properties. I'm going to mention what historic properties are here in a second, but I will say, so of all an inventory is like a survey where a professional goes out and looks for historic properties, which can include archaeological sites. Less than 20% of the state has been inventoried since the passage of this act. So, we're coming close to 60 years now of that. And so there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Most of the areas that have not been investigated are private lands, because there's not often projects or things like that happen on private lands that trigger the need for these inventories. We have a secure portal that we allow certain folks that meet certain qualifications to be able to look at these properties. Every person I think on this panel here has access to that. We give access to every tribe, and then archaeologists, things like that, but ones that meet certain criteria. And so far, of that, just under 20% of the state being surveyed, we've got approximately over 48,000 archaeological sites that have been recorded. People have been here for a very long time. Tribes, I don't mean to speak for tribes, but I've heard tribes often use the term since time immemorial. Archaeological data supports that, and it keeps getting the antiquity of people in Oregon keeps getting pushed back. It's a little over 18,000 years right now, and it just keeps going and going. So you just think about people living that long in Oregon and the types of places that they lived and did activities in and just lived their lives. There's a lot of that shows up archaeologically today. So we've got over 30,000 archaeological investigative reports that folks can look at through that portal. And one part of the National Historic Preservation Act that really is the one that I think we're all involved in the most, it's section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. And The Advisory Council on Historic Preservation was created specifically to write regulations for Section 106. So in the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106 is very brief, and it just basically says federal agencies will consider the effects of their undertakings on historic properties, or they must do that. The implementing regulations for Section 106 are, I can't even remember, they're about 10 pages long, very small type font in columnar format that explains the whole process from beginning to end. And it is a process, and that's what I always try to stress to agencies. There is no shortcut to any particular spot in that process. It begins with identifying the groups to consult with, tribes, the State Historic Preservation Office, for example, and then working through the potential effects, surveying what's called the area of potential effects, and identifying historic properties and evaluating them, and then assessing if they're going to be impacted by the undertaking. And then if so, can we avoid them? Can we minimize the effect, or can we mitigate? It goes on and on. There's a very lengthy process, and it's something that takes, I think, a long time to really wrap a person's head around. And so we get a lot of folks who are just starting out as archaeologists, for example, with a lot of questions about Section 106 process. But our main role is defined in these regulations. I don't think I actually wrote the regulations down. Like I think I was mentioning earlier, this is kind of a Frankenstein presentation I cobbled together from 2 presentations of mine. But it's 36 Code of Federal Regulations 800, or 36 CFR 800 is the implementing regulation. And our role is defined in there as reflecting the interests of the state and its citizens in the preservation of their cultural heritage, not including tribal historic preservation offices. So, we advise and assist federal agencies who are required to fulfill their responsibilities under Section 106, and we're supposed to cooperate with them and local governments and any organizations, individuals, etc., that have an interest in historic properties, and to make sure that they're all taken into considerations at all level of planning and development. It's one little paragraph. There's a lot packaged in there, and it doesn't always work out that easy. So we're always kind of like, poking agencies, going, hey, don't miss a step, and so that's a lot of what I do at my job now. This is just a figure that I pulled off of the Advisory Council's website. It's a kind of a detailed process, and I like this figure because they boiled it down into kind of a very easy flow chart here to follow. So you initiate the process, you identify historic properties, you assess effects, and then you try to resolve any effects. So as I mentioned, it's a process, and the critical part is—
And John, just to make sure folks are following this chart, so an undertaking, can you kind of give examples of what the process means? So, hey, we want to build a road, or what, just to break it down a little so people can think about it in ways that might apply to them.
Okay, so yeah, an undertaking is kind of a fancy word for a project. And anytime a federal agency funds a project, approves a project, or conducts a project on federally managed lands, they have to ask themselves, does this project have the potential to affect historic properties? And so that's their first thought on it. And if they believe that potential exists, that immediately triggers the Section 106 process. And then that immediately means they're calling Peter and Brees. If they're in areas that those tribes are interested in, they're contacting SHPO. They may be contacting Chelsea if they want to contract with Sula to do the work, to do some of the inventory work. And then the federal agency, if any historic properties are identified, they have to apply the National Register criteria, which I'll get to in a moment, and determine whether or not any of those are applicable, which would make the historic property eligible to the National Register of Historic Places. And by being eligible to the National Register, that then means that the next thing you have to do is, based on those qualities and characteristics that make this property eligible, will the building of the road or whatever the project is affect those to the point where the eligibility of the property may then become in question, which would be called an adverse effect. And that's when we look at, well, is there a way to redesign the project to avoid or minimize those impacts? Or if not, that's when we all sit down and we start talking about mitigation. What can we do to mitigate the damage that's going to happen here? So it's called the National Historic Preservation Act. There is preservation involved in this process, but it doesn't always happen that way. And that's when we get to mitigation, when there are adverse effects. And let's see here. This is from 36 CFR 800 in the definitions, and it defines historic property, because historic property is the term used in the National Historic Preservation Act, in addition to property of religious and cultural significance to an Indian tribe. But it's any building, site, district, structure, or object that's included in or eligible for the National Register. And when you look at that, also district, sorry. But when we look at these terms, and I'm not going to bore you with all the definitions, but in the National Register, each of those terms are defined. And I'm always telling archaeologists to look at those, because when they see the word site, they immediately think archaeological site. That's not how the National Register defines a site. The National Register defines a site as a place where something important happened. Could be an archaeological site, but it could also just be a place where an event or a pattern of events have happened. And so I'm always trying to get folks to look at that, because you could identify from research that a place might be important for Camas. You know, maybe there's a place name associated with Camas there. And, sometimes an archaeologist will go out and they might find a single object, like a piece of rock that, cracked or whatever from a fire. And they may look at that and go, well, that doesn't seem important, John. And they'll tell me that it's not eligible to the National Register. And I will probably respond to them, look at the context of the place you're in. You're in a place where people have been harvesting camas probably for a long time. Have you talked to the tribes about that? Maybe that piece of what we call fire cracked rock is related to camas processing. Maybe there was or camas ovens in the area, things like that. So these types of properties that the National Register defines can incorporate landscapes. It can incorporate stories. It can incorporate properties of religious and cultural significance. Some of you may have heard of traditional cultural properties, or TCPs. It can incorporate all of those. And it may be because it's a site, maybe because it's a district, things like that. So this is what we're really trying to message a lot here currently at SHPO, because sometimes there's some difficulty with that. And but I won't bore you with those details unless somebody has a question in the chat about it. So that's pretty much all I'm just flying through this
just
now.
to hop in, like all of those sites that you were just talking about, all of those could be on private property. So that's kind of how people
Correct.
gives them a good idea of how things get flagged as significant.
Right, absolutely. And so this is 800.4 of the regulations. It has some of my favorite language in the regulations. One part, 800.4 C1, for example, says the federal agency will acknowledge that tribes possess special expertise in identifying places of religious and cultural significance to them. So that agencies have to talk with tribes about that to get and acknowledge their expertise in those property types as well as others. But we identify, in consultation with the SHPO, the TIPO, any Indian tribe or Native Hawaiian organization that attaches religious cultural significance to properties, and guided by the Secretary of Interior standards, the agency official shall apply the National Register criteria. So this tells them after they've identified properties that might be affected by their undertaking, then they need to apply the National Register criteria to them. And I know that some of the folks on here, well, we know people who have struggled with this a little bit. So this is some of the stuff that we're trying to change at SHPO. But this is an area where in the past, archaeologists would just apply one of the criteria usually. And so the National Register bulletins actually give examples of all 4 of the criteria and how they apply to archaeological sites. So we're trying to push this more so that we're not missing characteristics that qualify place to the National Register, because if we miss those, then when we're assessing whether or not there's an adverse effect, we don't have all the information that we should have to make informed decisions. It's a really horrible copy of the National Register Bulletin. I'm old. I actually still have physical copies of these that I've had for almost 30 years, and they're well worn and scribbled on and everything else. But I keep them close at hand every day I'm at work, because I'm always looking at them, as well as the regulations. But criterion A, just to briefly describe it, are properties that are associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. That also includes patterns of events. So resource procurement areas, hunting areas, things like that. The repeated use of those areas by any group of people over a period of time, that would be considered a pattern of events. Because I probably should have mentioned this, the National Register is not just about significance at the national level. It's significance at the national level or the state level or the local level. And for the local level, that can be a community, and a community could be a tribe. And so if a tribe thinks that this place is exemplary of an important pattern of events, important to our history, it would apply. Criterion B is associated with the lives of persons significant in our past. And one of the interesting things about this is that there's a lot of room on what constitutes a significant person. And one of the bulletins, Bulletin 38, specifically calls out, I like to call them storied or legendary figures or things like that. Like there are a lot of stories about the time before people the tribes have, and specific stories about certain animals. Coyote is a prominent figure in those stories. And so sometimes a story associated with coyote, if it happens at a place, criterion B would apply. An archaeologist could walk there and not find an archaeological site, but that doesn't mean that criterion B doesn't apply. So I want them to be aware of that, and I want them consulting with tribes on these issues. Criterion C embodies the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction that represents the work of a master or possess high artistic values. Oftentimes for archaeological sites, these are associated with pictographs or petroglyph sites. Pictograph is painted rock image. Petroglyph is pecked or scratched image. I also, I hope I'm not getting too much into archaeological jargon, but I've also argued that archaeologists deal with types. There are a lot of tool types and things like that. And it says characteristics of a type, comma, period. Archaeologists deal with periods a lot of times too. And method of construction, we often find archaeological objects or things like that that have been manufactured by people. So I'm kind of advocating a little bit more for criterion C beyond just the pictographs and petroglyphs. And that's coming soon to guidance. So I'm giving you guys a sneak peek that I'm probably going, we're going to be kind of shifting gears on this specific criteria now a little bit, and we'll be working with folks to message that out here soon. This is the one that archaeologists mostly use. Have yielded or may be likely to yield information important to prehistory or history. We don't usually use the word prehistory anymore because it assumes that that there just isn't a history at some point, and that's not true. So oftentimes we'll use other terms now. One that I've heard for a while is pre-contact, like before Euro-Americans arrived. So basically the time when it was just the indigenous populations in North America. And I'm probably forgetting another one right now, but I'll move on.
And I just want to
Here,
hop in really quick. Sorry to keep interrupting, but there's so much information here. I want to make sure the landowners are kind of grasping the significance of it. So those 4 criteria, whenever you hire an archaeologist to come out and look at your place and kind of evaluate what needs to be done there, that is what they're weighing the situation on the ground against. And that's why everything is very situational. It's like whatever's happening at your place, does it meet any of these 4 criteria of significance? And so that's why it's really important to understand those, because that's the basis for something kind of becoming an archaeological or cultural resource.
Thank you. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And, one of the things I didn't mention about districts is I'm very amazed at how few archaeological districts or cultural districts there are in the state of Oregon, and I want to change that. Archaeological sites don't exist in a vacuum. It's, the Star Trek Enterprise didn't beam somebody to a place where they did stuff and then beam them somewhere else. It's whoever made that archaeological site or whatever group of people were there, at some point that day they woke up wherever they were either camped at or where their village was or whatever, and they probably did a lot of things, and this was probably an area that was nearby to that they would go to. And so you've got to look at it more as like these cultural systems, and I think it's possible to do more of the connecting of the dots. And so I feel like I'm getting a little jargony, but that's stuff that's important to me. And then I mentioned earlier 48,000-ish archaeological sites in Oregon. For the entire United States, there are a little over 2,600 National Historic Landmarks. As far as the honor of being listed on the National Register goes, National Historic Landmarks are supposed to be like a step above that. And there's a whole different process for dealing with National Historic Landmarks. I haven't included that in my presentation, but it happens so rare that there's a project that's going to affect a National Historic Landmark in Oregon that there are just a few, but one of them that Chelsea knows about is the Jacksonville Historic District, and that was designated a national landmark in 1966. And remember, the National Historic Preservation Act is passed in 1966, and the National Register is right around that time. I should know the year, but it's escaped me, but it's right around that time.
Jacksonville's the first on the West Coast, national landmark.
Yeah. So, and I can't remember how many we have in Oregon. I know another one. I don't like to talk about one of the ones I know about because the location is in the name, and I'll tell you why here in a second, why I can't really share that information. But I think that's it for federal laws. I'm going to fly through the state laws. They are not as process oriented. Usually, like with the National Historic Preservation Act, so it's an act, it's a federal act, it's a law. Then the 36 CFR implementing regulations for Section 106, that kind of fleshes out one part of that law. In Oregon, the implementing regulations are called administrative rules. So we have all these statutes here that I deal with in some capacity. Only one of them currently has an administrative rule that we just recently revised. And so this is something else that I would like to do. I'm running out of time. These things take about 2 years to from beginning to end on developing rules. we've got to work on them through a biennium, and I don't have that much time left before I retire. So, but I'd like to knock out as many of these as I can. But I'll just kind of go through them. So this one, the ORS 97 740 760 is the Indian Graves and Protected Object Statute. Among the things it defines are Indian tribe and professional archaeologists. And this one has the harshest penalty. Class C felony for removing, mutilating, defacing, injuring, or destroying any cairn, burial, human remains, funerary object, sacred object, or object of cultural patrimony of any native Indian, even through inadvertence. This is still a penalty. And one of the reasons why this is important, especially the part about inadvertence, a lot of times the bad people who like to loot and steal and dig for illegally for artifacts, they may be digging in a burial area or an area with a object of cultural patrimony or whatever without even knowing it. And they just went from one level of a violation to a very big violation, which is why you should never do any of that while I'm on the topic. But this is the harshest penalty that we have. And I hate to say it, but we're working here with Brees and Peter and the other tribes. It happens too often. It happens too often throughout the state that we're all being brought together to deal with an issue related to this statute. Our office is named in the statute as one of the points of contact. State police is named, and also the Legislative Commission on Indian Services is named, and they recently hired for the first time in the state's history a state physical anthropologist who works specifically with these cases on behalf of LCIS. So it doesn't get any easier dealing with them, but I would just say that this is one of the things that we have to deal with too often, and it kind of those aren't good days. I'll just say. The next statute, real quick, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on it, but this is one where it requires state agencies to develop and implement policies on relationships with tribes. So if they're going to do an action or an activity, or if they're going to sign something or whatever, and that act has the potential to negatively affect tribes, this policy is supposed to allow the tribes to become more aware of it. They're supposed to be working with them. On the federal side, it's called government to government consultation. This is kind of the state's version of that to some extent. This is the reason why I didn't want to talk about one of the National Historic Landmarks, the location of archaeological sites, because there are some bad actors in the state that like to collect these things for themselves to try to sell or just to have in their home or whatever. We are not allowed to disclose the location of archaeological sites. So those people like on the panel here who have access to our data, they had to, meet certain criteria to be able to do that. I've been at SHPO for 13 years. One time in 13 years have we ever had to remove somebody from having access to our data because they were not keeping the location secret. And matter of fact, they were sharing it with folks for I won't even go into it, but so it's good that this is the livelihood of most archaeologists or people in this line of work. So it would be really silly for somebody to not take these laws serious. So because you could lose your ability to do work.
And I just want to hop on that real quick, John, because that's one of the challenges for folks, local planners and some other agencies. cities when trying to navigate the triggers for these laws, because they don't have access to those maps. To use Jacksonville as an example, there is the map that I can access and my colleagues can access that shows where all the known archaeological sites are. And other, the planners or the other departments can't access that for those reasons and under that law. And that can also cause more confusion and more challenges for the homeowners who are trying to get a straight answer. Is there a site on my property or not? So just to give a little context, that's the tensions we're working within. And that is why that exists, even though sometimes if you're trying to get information, it can seem like a barrier that's unfair or unreasonable, but there is reason behind it, just to bring that.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chelsea. Yeah, it would be great if we could tell folks, but a lot of times we'll have folks contact us because they're interested in purchasing a property, and they're like, can you tell me if there's an archaeological site there? And we can't, but you could hire Chelsea or another archaeologist to get the information for you to help with that. The exemption to public disclosure is for state employees. If we get a public records request, we don't have to provide the location of archaeological sites. But if somebody were to hire an archaeologist, the archaeologist, can work with them. And I think I'd also leave it up to the archaeologist to, vet out if the intentions of the person that's hiring them are good, that they are really just interested in that. Because there are some really good landowners who are good stewards of archaeological sites on their property. That biface cache I mentioned at the beginning is one of those. And I'm almost done, but since I brought it up again, just a weird little side note on that. The landowner was a math teacher in Salem, and he took another teaching job and when I was out there, my son was like 5 years old, and I brought him out there one of the days to kind of see what daddy did, I guess. And then the teacher moved to another school, and happens to be the middle school that my son goes to now. So it's kind of a weird coincidence about that. So I was there at a parent teacher day and saw him. So it was kind of cool. But anyway, back to the boring statutes here. This one here defines a lot of the things at the state level for an archaeological object, an archaeological site of significance, an archaeological site. Even though one of the earlier statutes I talked about deals with Native American burials, funerary objects, human remains, and all that, this is the statute where those are defined. So it's interesting that they're defined here, but the penalty for violating this statute is less severe than the previous one, but it's still, nobody wants to violate a statute and have to deal with all these things. And so I just can't stress that enough, because it's just not a favorite part of my job to have to deal with those types of things. But that's kind of what this is. And it's a little bit different too, because in the state law, archaeological sites have to at least be 75 years old. And in the federal law, they have to be at least 50 years old. So it's a little bit weird, especially when we're dealing with a federal project that's on state land. So then all the laws are applicable. And when that happens, we just defer to the 50-year for those examples. And then the last one is our permit statute. It just defines, it just states pretty much the same thing that's in the previous law, that a person cannot excavate, alter, or injure an archaeological site. In the previous statute, it says on private land or public land. This statute was not changed when they changed private land on the previous statute, but DOJ has weighed in on this and said that if it's in the other statute, it's applicable here as well. So our permit process is for private lands and for non-federal public lands. And it talks a little bit about Same with the Secretary of Interior standards, but these are a little bit different for the qualifications to be able to apply for a permit. The only reason I put that in here was because sometimes people think that they're permitting the project so the project can happen, and that's not really the case. They're permitting the archaeologist to do an investigation in order for the project to proceed. Is kind of how I look at it. Since I like sharing with everybody, and especially in a presentation that's being recorded, probably one of the worst pictures of myself captured in video. We did have a rule advisory committee last year, and we updated the rules. The first time the rules had been updated in just about 30 years, and it was badly needed. And so that new rule was implemented on July 1st of 2023, and we're tracking to see how well it's working, because usually after about a year, we are given an opportunity to tweak it if we need to. Minor tweaks, we can't do anything major changes, but if we find a typo, for example, or things like that. But so we're looking at that. We were able to even put the new state physical anthropologist, put their role in that process a little bit. And I just want to finish a little bit. It's kind of serendipitous that Brees mentioned people in place, and he also said practice. I didn't have that last word in there, so I feel bad now. But before I was at Chippewa, I worked for a tribe in Washington for 8 years, and this next set of photos just sort of, to me, captures a little bit about what I think archaeologists need to be thinking about. And they need to be thinking about the people and the place. So this is behind the Grand Coulee Dam, about 100 river miles behind the Grand Coulee Dam, at one of the two major fisheries on the Columbia River. And the waters were rising, and the fishery at Kettle Falls was going to be inundated. That had been a place where tribal people, indigenous people, had fished for thousands of years. And in 1941, they were there as the waters were rising before it was going to be gone. And this woman here she's put out some fish over a fire, and she's working. This was called the Ceremony of Tears. There were lots of folks camped here. And this is the tribe that I worked for, and 80. Let's see if I can do math here. 60, about 70 years after this photo was taken. I worked with my all tribal crew aside from myself on an archaeological excavation at this project. And at one time we stopped. And this was before fancy cell phones and all that. So I screwed my camera into a tripod and I set it up and put it on a timer. And we're standing back here on this landform, getting a photo. Just for reference, this hill in the background, you'll see it in my photo as it shows up. And this is during a drawdown of the reservoir, and the falls are still gone. They're not exposed anymore. All the people, I'm on the far right, all the people to my left are their grandparents or great grandparents and beyond fished those waters behind us for thousands of years, since time immemorial. And it was really it had an impact on me, because it was an interesting place to work. We were all kind of fascinated with what we were doing, but you could also, this is just my external view, but I also kind of felt the sadness there, that they weren't around to know what that was like to fish there. They only know those stories. And there was a peninsula that jutted out into the river there. And these two images are from that peninsula. That's where the village was at while they were fishing. So it was usually in the summer, the late later part of the summer. On the left, that's a painting by Paul Kane from 1846. And that's people that he was there to witness a dance that the people were dancing, and he kind of painted them, and you can see the structures in the background. And then here on the one on the right, that's a photo from the folks that were up surveying the boundary between the United States and Canada in 1865, which is not far from Kettle Falls. And they went down and they had brought cameras with them, and they took a bunch of photos of the tribe there fishing, took photos of the fish and all that. All these photos are curated in Great Britain, I think. But I'm going to stop there. I hope I didn't take up too much time, but
Thanks, John.
Thanks for the opportunity.
So that was a lot of information for everybody. And are you ready for the test? Just kidding. But a lot of that is going to come into, it's going to be applied in some of the conversations we're going to have from here on. So it's going to start to make sense. We wanted you to kind of have a baseline for reference. We're already getting some technical questions about some of the triggers and how they apply to private property. But before, I want to get a chance for Peter and Breeze to talk a little bit. So Peter, if you want to talk a little bit to the values of this, and also as a reminder, you know, for folks who heard the land acknowledgement in the beginning, you know, the Grand Ronde and the Silettes are located far to the north, but they, you know, part of those tribes are people from our area. And because of the Rogue River War, which was a violent and led to the violent displacement of those folks, they, you know, that's why kind of the landscape looks the way it does in terms of where these reservations are located today. So Peter, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of the values behind some of these things, or whatever you want to say before we move on to the applied stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, in terms of speaking of these broader values and how they're implemented in partnership with the state, John did a really wonderful job of explaining a lot of those touch points. And yeah, the way we thought we'd divide it is that at least from just one tribal perspective, I'd talk about the why, and Brees would talk a little bit about the how of what we do. And let's see. So where I happen to live, the former Kalapuya village of Champenafu, here, what we now call Corvallis, where Oregon State University is located. I had the privilege yesterday evening of going to a event that we only do in the wintertime, and in this case for the public at Oregon State, with a bunch of tribal folks telling coyote and other traditional stories that we gather for during this time of the winter. And I mention that because you know, I think that probably all of the landowners on this call have a deep love for you know, the places that they steward. And I think that is something that we all hold in common and can carry forward in common. But one of the things that separates the tribal perspective in exactly the way that John was talking about at Kettle Falls, repeated 100 times over, you know, across 1,000 times over, you know, across this broader landscape of the Pacific Northwest in the United States and et cetera, is that, you know, taking, for instance, my my mom's side of the family, who is Catholic, you know, the stories that people of that faith tell to explain the world, those events are set, you know, in say in Jerusalem, say at the sites of sacrifice of so many saints across Europe, as you know, the religion is developing. Our stories are places that tie the different peoples that make up our confederations to their place are specific to where we come from, and are not are in some ways about how the world is ordered and how it was set up for our people who are recorded. These beings in the stories are always talking about the next people will see you. This is how things are being set up for them, and that's not that's both cosmic and specific to that falls, that rock out in front of that village, though the places that make these beloved homelands what they are. And I think everybody who comes here finds finds Oregon beautiful. People of all kind of backgrounds from all over. But there are different views about how you manage land, and a lot that the state of Oregon now has to work to, in many ways, overcome the values of its founding. So again, where I live in the Willamette Valley, one of the main kind of acts of early American colonization was the Jason Lee mission up by Willamette Mission State Park, and then at Salem, what became Willamette University. And after the first initial phase of kind of the most idealistic missionaries, there was a second set, among them a guy named Reverend Gustavus Hines, and I quote him often because I think he was trying to set up a little spin-off project to go set up another mission among particular ancestors of mine, families that I'm related to, Coolidge people on the lower Umpqua River. Didn't like the time that he had down there, turned back, and wrote, when he was writing about the experience after he'd returned to the United States, said that it was his impression that the doom of extinction is suspended over this wretched race, and that the hand of Providence is removing them to give place to a people more worthy of this beautiful and fertile country. And you can echo that right on through. Just a few years after he wrote those words, the Table Rock Sentinel right there in Jacksonville, openly calling in its editorials for the extermination of Indian people after the outbreak of the last and most deadly of the Rogue River Wars in the fall of 1855. And so so that is to say that Siletz is a long way from Medford, from Jacksonville, from Ashland, from these places that our folks, and as I mentioned, my tribal side of the family is from the Central Coast. This is in some ways not my story to tell, but that the act of removal from that homeland was tragic, but and was violent, but was also not complete. Extermination came all too damn close to happening, but it didn't happen. And so we today have a duty to our ancestors, have a duty to those stories, have a duty to the dead, at least in my view, which as well as all the other things that tribes are called upon to do to serve our members. And I reflect a little bit about what that act of removal and what that sense of homeland means. A lot of you will, who've been in the Rogue Valley a little while, will have known the late Agnes Baker Pilgrim, Grandma Aggie, to many, many people who were not her blood relatives, who passed in 2019, but I'm always struck by this quote from a headman at Siletz, who was her great uncle, Cholcolta or Tai George, who, when an Indian inspector came after people had been on the reservation for about a year, said this to be transmitted back to Washington, which was then published in the Congressional Record. I would ask, am I and my people the only ones who have fought against the whites that we should be removed so far from our native country? It is not so great a hardship for those who've always lived near here, but to us is it a great evil. If we could, it'd be even on the borders of our native land where we could sometimes see it, we would be satisfied. I've kept silent until now. Time has come when I can talk out. I want the president to know how we feel about it. I am carried further away from my country than anybody else. My heart is not bad, it is sick. Palmer told us when he bought our country that we could live at the Table Rock and Evans Creek for 5 years. Then we would have to come to the reservation. I told Palmer that we would never consent to sell him those lands. We wanted them only to live upon. We could always fish and hunt there. We only wanted the mountains, which were of no use to the whites. And so what I mean to say is that that duty, that relationship is not severed. It is, in our view, perpetual, and we have come a long way in the attitudes of the institutions that we share this place with, in terms of seeing those connections, seeing that culture as something of value, as we all, no matter our backgrounds, try to face up to the uncertainties and figure out how to live in this pretty wild 21st century that we're all experiencing. And so, we it's too this is too short an event to really go through tribal history, but all those tribes in Western Oregon, all of this incredibly disastrous, intentionally, all of this Indian policy meant to degrade tribal land base and tribal identity was considered a rip-roaring success in the eyes of the federal government, to the extent that they passed the Western Oregon Termination Act in order to, in the view of the feds in the 1950s, free tribal folks from the obligation of being under the thumb of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and thereby terminate any obligation that they had. It, happened to occur just around the time some of our tribal folks finally started winning their land claims cases in the courts. In any case, it is the transformation since then. It is with the help, since the 70s of like partners like Senator Hatfield back in the day, who pursued the bill that that allowed for Siletz restoration in 1997 or 1977, and future leaders for other tribes that for whom restoration has come since. But it's the truth of it is that we are institutions that have had to build up from nothing since those dates of restoration, and so we're often small staffs covering a large land base, and a lot of really more and more partners every year that that want a piece of everything from trying to see how the trying to get help in stewarding these important places, all the way to helping wanting help wordsmithing these land acknowledgement statements. And so so we're happy to do it. We're happy to do what we do. We can also be, because of being pulled in all those different directions, harder to get a hold of than we might wish. We'd all give a real hard consideration to cloning if they perfected the technology, because there's an awful lot to do. So happy to, if that sparks any questions for folks, I am more than happy to talk more, but I'm looking at our time and I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I guess I should turn it over to Brees.
Yeah, and one of the things I just want to follow up on that too, again, to drive it home to the landowners, is like a lot of these processes when we work in Oregon, even if you have a historic building in Jacksonville, the tribal consultation is a really important part of that. And that is why what Peter just said, this historical through contemporary connection to this place and the history, how it's so intertwined. So that's why these relationships are still really important and relevant, and why our tribal collaboration and consultation is really key to anything we do in Southern Oregon, no matter how old it is or not. So yeah, Brees.
Yeah, thank you. All three of you. It's really awesome setup. So I'm going to be a little redundant just so that I can catch my own flow here. And do a little bit of stage setting myself I can share a little bit about the applied, kind of the practical everyday, what that looks like. But I did want to come back to something that Peter was saying, which I think is really vitally important for stage setting. And I'm going to start a little outside and then bring it into what Peter was saying. But the point is that the past and really the laws as process meet many needs, not the least of which is to identify proof of a past. It is evidence of people doing things on the landscape. So the same way that there's a steam donkey or a mine adit or a can dump out there, those are proof. And those are proof of multiple narratives simultaneously. They're evidence that marginalized people may have been brought in or paid under market rate, or it's proof and demonstration of theft of land in some cases. It can get very intriguing. So if we can accept that that's a way of understanding this evidence that's left behind by actions of the past, then we can also step in and go, every broken arrow point, every broken flake left behind to make that arrow point is also evidence of people thousands of years ago sitting there, doing something there. And that's a very unique moment for one tribe, and I don't want to speak for others, to demonstrate that in spite of, really 200 years of American doctrine and centuries before that of just overall colonial action to erase the identity and displace the identity of those peoples whose lineal descendants live right here today and have direct connection. Those are very important. Those bits of stone are important just because it's evidence that they existed. And the laws should, I believe, you're getting interpretation, should be given the moment of that process that says, I acknowledge this blank, this cup is found on the piece of real estate, wherever that is, whether that's a personal property or public lands. This is that opportunity. And back to John's point about the process. And so I'm going to segue back into now some of this every day, that with that, the laws apply equally. It doesn't say can dumps are more important than the 2,000-year-old arrow point, or that a bowl is more important than a steam donkey. The laws don't get to have those value judgments. Interpretation and application of the law does, through those 4 criteria that John mentioned. And that's really important, because from one tribe, we want to make sure that we take the value judgment out. That law needs to apply, because I need for the law to recognize that that flake that may be the only evidence in a place of a community having lived there 2,000 years ago is there in proof that somebody was there. That's important in the face of American colonial doctrines. So, but the law doesn't care about that. The law just says we have to learn that it existed, and that how much of an area constitutes an archaeological site or a place of practice. And that practice could be something like gathering first foods or stewardship and management. The same acts that most people are doing on their lands today. They have a garden, or they want to make sure that the irrigation and the water flow is right. But this is all really important. And so there's a concept called ancestry out there that brings shared concepts and helps to recognize that there is a way to go forward in this. And that, I think, starts to set up complementary rather than conflict in how we go forward with the inevitable question. I found a thing on my property. What do I do now? And that's the kind of responsive action. And I would say the laws are set up for potential application in both a proactive way and a reactive way. And John can speak more to this, Chelsea can, in their ways. But in our office, we look at this most of our time is spent with the reactive process. I found a thing. What do I do? Because I want to be a good person. And there are different values that go into that. From one tribe's perspective, can you leave it be? Can you leave it where you found it? That may vary. Maybe it's at risk from erosion or development or theft, in all fairness, right? Or can it be something that just reinters? With the communities associated with Grand Run, there's a belief in a cultural value that says, if it's not given to you, it is not yours. That flies in the face of American land ownership law of 9/10 of the law. I own it. It is mine. And I'm imagining I may be ruffling some feathers. But please understand, I think many of us teach our children, if it's not given to you, it's not yours. And that one of the best things you can do is just leave it be. Take a picture, not a point, or report its location. And that sets up the next thing that I'm guessing there's some anxiety about. Well, if I report this to the tribe, they're going to come and take it, and they're going to come and take my land. And no. And first, I don't think any of us have the staff to manage that. Second, I don't know. Peter might, but it's, that's not what the law allows. The law says follow the process. Identify, minimize. If you can't avoid it, step one, avoid. And that's where putting it back. If your action isn't going to do disturbance, try putting it back. That's what we encourage people to do. Or can you move the placement of the pole barn, to leave a place alone. Just a simple avoidance. A lot of practical solutions. If that can't occur, can we minimize it? Like, well, rather than sticking, cutting the driveway right through this or running the irrigation straight through this, can we throw in a bit of a jog or find a way of minimizing what that impact is going to be? And there's a cost benefit in both of those right there. Avoid it. You're not doing any damage or harm. And, that's John's world. But we encourage that. If you minimize, that means that there's less archaeological costs that you're going to incur. We're only going to do this much, and that means we only need to record this much of an area. Then there's the big one, mitigation in the stepped process. And that's where things get really kind of complicated and all sorts of, that's going to cost a lot. And that can be the case. And that is an unfortunate situation. And and there's a concern that because people may feel that because it costs so much, I'm going to take a risk. I'm just going to go ahead and do the damage. Nobody's looking over my shoulder, right? We're going to be okay until you get caught. And that then becomes one of those violations. And then you hear from me and maybe other tribes about, hey, did you know that was there? Did you knowingly impact, alter, destroy an archaeological site? That's a violation. And that gets to be a real concern. So that then begs one of those other questions. Well, how do we find out? And I've got an example for that. And what can we do proactively in this? And proactively, I would say, reaching out. And to Peter's point, we are all understaffed, and I get the fortunate opportunity to work with a fairly sizable staff dedicated to this sort of work. And even we are stretched. We're just doing our annual counts, and we are at, collectively amongst the staff, we're going to be around 12,000 interactions. That's Zoom calls, that's emails, that's responses and back and forths on anything. That's a lot of time when, but that's what's necessary. So that is part of the job. But in that, sharing with the tribe in advance, hey, we're looking at doing X on our property. Maybe we're getting a USDA grant to, I don't know, pond straightening, I don't know. And so there you have a federal undertaking because it's a federal agency with federal dollars. And we're going to see that project through that lens. And that's something that I don't think many people are aware of, is tribes are afforded opportunity to see any project under at least 4 different lenses. If there's an Army Corps permit, tribes have the opportunity to see that. The Department of State Lands permit, tribes have the opportunity to read and review and comment. If there's a land use planning under DLCD, there's a chance that the tribe can review and comment. And there are several others in there. Oh, if it's a fish-bearing stream through NOAA and NEMS, there's a chance that the tribe may get to review and comment. So working with the tribe in advance winds up being a better opportunity because we're going to see it through these other lenses. And if we have advanced knowledge, then we can be consistent in how we respond through each of those. And so there's an efficiency in that, so that there's not a missed moment within water work windows, really practical, or trying to thread the needle with early fall rains, or the snow sticks around a little longer, so your spring window gets a little shorter. These are all opportunities. So normally I'm anticipating a question here that I normally get, which is, so when should we talk to you? And my simple answers, because I like to keep things simple. When you think about a project, it's probably a good time to reach out. Just in concept, it's cheap. That it's just a concept. And chances are, if you've thought of it now, somebody else has thought of it previously, or somebody's going to think the same project in the future. So just have that conversation. If you're seeking outside funds for a project, when you start to ask for money, you should probably talk to a tribe, because there's a good chance that you're going to get a reminder of, you didn't ask enough for cultural resource costs. That's a real cost and should be a separate line in any budget when it comes to field and identification, just processing, getting the permit, writing up a report of findings, dealing with the next steps. That's a very real cost. So and if you're applying for grant dollars, we've worked with many granting agencies and to make sure that cultural resource costs can be included in the monies being requested, so that it doesn't undermine the actual action cost. So there's an efficiency there. But if there isn't the reminder to make sure to ask for it, you lose that opportunity. Next part, you've gone through your concept and you have the money. So you've asked for it and now you've received it. The world of opportunity is starting to solidify. Your wiggle room for changing alignment and redesign plans starts to narrow. That means if you start to find anything archaeologically or cultural resource wise, that cost goes up relative to your overall budget. And that's also a time delay. It's not just a financial cost, it's a time cost. So, but there's still wiggle room. You can still find some savings by working with. The next stop is when you start spending money, you're committed. Your budget is locked. At best, you have your 20% over, but you're hedging your bets on that 20% for a lot of other things. But if you didn't include the cultural resource cost up front, you just lost easily 50% of that 20%. So you only have 10%, and it depends on the scale and size of your project and your undertaking. But I have seen some projects where cultural resource costs were easily 20 to 25% of the total undertaking. Because the opportunities to talk and learn about tribe knew there was a thing there, and that had the conversation been had early in that process, would have said, can you build elsewhere? Avoid. Or I see why you're needing to build here. How do we minimize this? Can you bring in meters of fill over this? And protect in place, and then capture that, yeah, there is a likely archaeological site under this, and get that captured in an easement or a covenant on a property so that it is understood forever until it's identified and confirmed that the potential still exists. And so the project gets to go forward, there's less worry, life goes on. So I'm speaking at a very big macro scale. How does that come down to a very practical, everyday scale?
And Breeze,
Um,
I want
yes,
you to say that stuff, but let me do a
yes,
let
please.
me give people like a summary stuff, and then I think what you're about to say is going to be pointed questions that we're getting, and we can contextualize it so it'll tie in. So just to go, we have heard a lot of great content in the last hour and a half, and I just want to make sure everybody's able to kind of digest it. So number one, the baseline, even on private property in Oregon, if it is 75 years or older, it could be an archaeological site. In areas where it's a historic landmark or where you have a known resource, oh, that's the old whatever cool thing, you know, it's hard for you to argue that you don't know a site could be there. And then also we've established, and I can attest from personal experience, there's vast evidence of indigenous occupation across all of Southern Oregon. So there's a lot of chances for archaeological sites to be present. Does every private property have an archaeological site of significance on it? No. So this isn't supposed to scare you, but there's enough out there that you want to be proactive. So that's what Brees is saying. If you find something, what do? Do you, if you aren't going to do anything, you can just, you know, note it, leave it there, avoid it. If you are, you know, you're like, hey, we know this is here, but we were going to subdivide, we were going to build a barn, we were going to do whatever. So what I want to get into, because we're seeing a lot of these questions in the last half hour or less than half hour, I really want to make sure we cover these three things. So number one, because this is a quick one, and then we'll get to the specifics Brees was about to talk to at the cost. So archaeology is expensive. You know, the field work is fun. We can get a bunch of volunteers, students out there, whatever, but that's not the expensive part. You know, I think there's like something like for every hour in the field, there's 4 days in the lab kind of a thing. And it does work out that way. So that is a big burden on private property owners. So a lot of the work that we do on private property does have some kind of federal, there's an easement of some sort, whether it's Bureau of Rec or Army Corps. And so in those cases, sometimes there are opportunities for those costs to be offset by the federal agency. When there's not that overlap, and it is a private undertaking that somebody wants to build a condo or do whatever, what opportunities are there for them to get some support? So John, I know this is one of your pet peeves, is there isn't a fund to help support private landowners for these kind of things. But just if the three of you just quickly, because I know there's not a great answer for this,
Yep.
but if there is a quick way to respond to what are some options that private landowners could look for to kind of offset some of these costs, because they can be substantial.
I can lead off. I'll start with there's always an ask that, well, you're a tribe, you have a casino, can you pay to do this? No. So, all right, we've got that out of the way. But, you know, what we ask is, let's have a conversation. Let's actually get into what is it that you're wanting to do, and how does it, you know, how can it be done? Is there a way of looking at what you're planning to do in a way that we can have a conversation that minimizes that cost? And in many cases, they're fairly small points of contact, small touch, and we can work together in building confidence with each other and learning, oh, actually what you're really wanting to do is not that, you know, it's fairly minimal in the ground disturbing activity. It's not likely to impact something. Or let's start by having somebody do a desktop exercise. Let's go through some visual map records. Let's start to understand, based on easily accessible information, is it likely to be a problem or a place of concern? We've seen many properties that are on a riverbank, for instance, that going to historic maps, we see that actually the property of concern is actually newly accreted soil. because of the meander and deposition. So that it's new real estate, if you will, and there's a very, very low likelihood of there being an archaeological site or other resources of concern. So that's one example of a couple of minutes of conversation and everybody's heartburn comes down.
And that's one of the things, to reiterate what you were saying earlier, and this is something that I always say, is consult early and often, because on a lot of these places, you're going to have to do this work no matter what. So wouldn't you rather find out in the early design phase so it can be built in and you can minimize whatever impact you might have to archaeological sites, which could equal cost savings, but also so you don't have the contractor showing up in a week and you just realize that you have to do archaeological treatment. So that's one of the things that's important. And I know that there isn't a dedicated state fund for this. Maybe someday there'll be like some kind of grant, but there are Jacksonville, for example. I keep citing Jacksonville because that's one of the ones we work in most commonly. They are a certified local government, so they do have non-competitive grant funds that are available every other year. So sometimes that's an opportunity. You can work with the city to be like, I'm doing this great thing and it's going to have some costs. Maybe there's a way to help. There are also some other grants that you could apply to, but it is a tricky thing. And your best bet is to talk to someone as soon as possible so that you can minimize your impact and you don't get bit. I'm going to move on in the interest of time to our next questions. And they both are kind of along the same thing. They're about process and how people navigate that. So just to go through some examples. So sometimes people know there's a site there, or sometimes they're digging and they find 100 bottles or a cache of something. But other times there are triggers, like, for example, the planning or the county or city planning might trigger something. So do you want to speak a little bit to anybody there? What might be some of these triggers? So if you are changing the use of a property, if you're subdividing a property, if you are, somebody asked about habitat restoration, you know, what are some of the things that people that they are going to need to think about? Anytime you've got federal monies coming in, or, you know, public monies, public lands, but on private land, do you want to give some examples, anybody here, of when they need to reach out to SHPO and the tribes and make sure that they have that consultation in place? What are some of the things that they need to do that for?
Well, yeah, there's lots of things. I mean, you know, one of the common things with archaeological sites is ground disturbance is going to be damaging to it. Obviously, from my discussion, there are other property types as well.
But let's back up and say that they don't know, it's not a recorded site. So this is just a landowner. Maybe they're in Jacksonville, maybe they're somewhere that, you know, a historical area, or maybe not. Like, how would they anticipate what would be a trigger?
Yeah, if they wanted to do that, they could check, you know, they could either see if they could get an archaeologist to look for them. We have trouble getting to everything, just for you know, to full disclosure. But if somebody sent us something and said, hey, we're going to do this on our property, you know, and I was going to lay eyes on it, what I do is I either send a letter going, there is a site there. So, and I'd cite the statute, and then I'd say, you're going to need to probably get an archaeologist to help out with it. But if there isn't a site, and like I said, very little of the private lands in Oregon have been surveyed, so we just don't know. Then we would say, well, we don't know if anything's there, but nobody's ever looked. So if you see something at all during your project, please stop when that happens, and then here are some steps that you should do. We always sign off our letters also with saying, if you haven't already, please consult with tribes too, because that's important. But that's one way to do it. You know, it's interesting because sometimes when, like, I'm not trying to do this to scare private landowners, but the way some of our stuff works, when we send a agency a letter like that and we say, yeah, you know, we don't have anything there, but boy, that sure seems like an area where there's likely to be an archaeological site. So we would recommend a survey. And if they go, too bad, Shippo, we're not gonna do that. Well, if they don't damage a site or we never hear about it, then that's fine. It's kind of like some of the stuff Brees was saying. But if they do hit the site, and all that, then part of the administrative rule for permits says something to the effect of, to what extent could you already have understood the need that you would have needed a permit, and an archaeologist out there. And so that doesn't mean that we're going to go throw the book at somebody if they contact us after that happens. But the difference is that if they had followed our recommendation to begin with, they would qualify under that rule for an expedited permit. So if they got an archaeologist, it would take 48 hours or less before the archaeologist could start doing their work. If they didn't follow the guidance, they don't get that expedited treatment. So then it's a 30-day permit review, and so the delay is a bit longer, and that's just the way it's worded in our rule.
What about damage assessments? If they did impact an archaeological site, and you could make the argument that, well, we told you there could be one there, on private property, are damage assessments hardly ever, like, does that come into play? Like, you damaged it, so now you have to mitigate the damage to what you already did.
Well, yeah, so there's a step before that for us at the state. So whenever there is a statute violation, I have to report that to DOJ. And then usually the DOJ will call me very shortly after I do that. And they ask me a bunch of questions like, was this, intentional? Was it an accident? Just to get as much information as they can. And then they also ask for my recommendations on, going forward. So let's say my recommendation was like, hey, this was an accident. They contacted us right away, and we would recommend a damage assessment. Then they might work with us and state police and tribes to, and the landowner to see if they're willing to do that, or, and so it does happen, but that's part of also like what Brees was saying. It's like, if you make an effort to reach, even if we don't respond, if you make a request for us to look at something and we just couldn't get to it or whatever, that still shows good intent, So,
Yeah.
And that is all taken into consideration with things. And I know in the interest of time here, I'll hurry up, but like archaeologists make mistakes too. Those two, the statute, public land and private land, they have different triggers for when a permit's needed. And sometimes an archaeologist thinks they're on private land where the circumstances of where they're excavating does not require a permit. And then they find out, oh, I guess we were on state land or, public land, and they should have had a permit. And we get a few of those every year where we get a call, and usually they self-report and they're very embarrassed by it. And I have to tell them that I still have to contact DOJ and do that process. But when DOJ contacts me, I said, hey, they self-reported, it was an accident and all that, and that's fine. They do need to make sure they don't make a habit of it, because then it gets to where we're like, well, maybe there's an issue going on with your understanding of how to determine land ownership. But I'll stop there.
Well, and I think the bottom line, what we're hearing here emphasized, is that nobody wants to be the bad guy. We all want to work together. Nobody's trying to stop folks from improving the livability of their communities. It's just about, trying to advocate for these resources because they have such important stories to tell. And if we had more time, we could give more examples. But one of the things I want to just talk about in the last few minutes we have is one of the things that can cause so much anxiety for folks in thinking about, well, we want to buy this place, we want to move here, but we don't know what could be there, is that there is no easy answer, because it all depends on the site, what happened there, what you're going to do, how you're going to impact it. So that can be really challenging for folks who don't work in this world to navigate. And it can be really challenging for us in the middle to try to, be like, I can't give you an answer because I don't know all the facts yet. So it's so situational, which can be frustrating. But that gets me to the point of protocols. So I know that a lot of you are saying contact us, but there are specific processes for that. So if you are a landowner and you want to do something, there's two things here. Number one, hey, I found a cool artifact. Email me, don't bug them about that because they're very busy. Two is, hey, I need something done and I need to know what the process is. Who do I contact and what does that look like? So can you all give your preferred process for that and the best way that folks will get an answer, and maybe two things, if it's an informal, I'm thinking about this, versus a formal submission of a proposal.
I can, am I off mute? I'll be real quick. I reach out. We're going to ask probing questions, not to get into your business, but so that we can give you a recommendation about next steps. And generally those next steps are going to be contact a qualified archaeologist in your area. We like to see people with experience in the neighborhood, not contact somebody from Maine that says, oh yeah, I know how to dig a hole. Oregon is unique. That's why Oregon is Oregon. And so, want somebody with experience in the area. And we're also going to point you to John's office and the website to get informed, because I want people to know and feel confident that I'm not just telling them my opinion to my best outcome as a representative of the tribe. I want people to just have full awareness. No, you're just hearing I hope we get it right, what the law is and how you can go forward. And, you talked about, or kind of alluded to, in-kind use. So that's one of the questions that we'll ask is, are you doing the same thing? Is it you're switching from corn to rye? I don't know. We probably wouldn't have that much heartache, but we're also going to say, make sure that you confer with the state archaeology office, because that is theirs to make the determination. We can lead you up to that edge, but we're not empowered as a tribe to make a categorical statement. That is the state's responsibility. So,
and I'll jump in on that too. On our website, we have archaeology bulletins. One deals with archaeological sites on private lands and the laws, applicable laws. One deals with archaeological sites on public lands. We also have one on how to hire an archaeologist. So we have some guidance documents there. We have what's called we're still working on updating our submission process, and that's years away. But currently there's a we call it Go Digital, and there's a email that's clearance email, we call it. And there's a form that people can fill out and provide us with information, and then that gets sent in, and then that lands with one of the archaeologists in our office to review. One of the things that's critical about that is, like, if somebody owns 400 acres and they just provide their post office box address, that's not telling us like where the project is. We want to know specifically where, like, there's going to be some activity. Archaeological sites don't often have addresses, so we have to use like lat long or universal translocator UTMs, like GPS data, to be able to zero in on an area to check in our records. So, but there is a submittal form that you can provide information about a project or a potential project, and then that will get it on somebody's desk to review. At least that's, you know, kind of how it's supposed to work, but we get overwhelmed sometimes for full disclosure.
And I'm putting right now the website for the oregon.gov/OPRD/bunch of stuff. And that's got all the archaeological resources on there. And again, just to reiterate, so you saw a lot of stuff in the beginning about laws pertaining to archaeological land and how it works in federal projects and stuff. But and correct me if I'm wrong, but if it is an archaeological site, which in Oregon is defined by 2 or more artifacts, it doesn't matter if it's a federal project or not, it's still treated as an archaeological site. And so all of those things, those protocols need to be followed. So if you are somewhere where you know, or you have a good reason to think that it could have archaeological deposits on there, being something that's really old, all it takes is 2 artifacts before you could be working in an archaeological site and potentially cause harm to it. If you talk to someone early, whether it's the tribe or a professional archaeologist, there's the potential that you could make the argument that what you're doing wouldn't be an impact, or you could maybe learn about how to document historical disturbances on that property. And there's different ways that you could cover yourself to make sure that it's clear you understand the rules and you're complying and doing your best effort to not impact an archaeological site with your project going forward. So with that, we just have a few minutes left. So I guess just Peter, did you have anything else you want to say, or if anybody else has anything else they want to say? Does anybody have any other specific ways to follow up or resources that you could connect folks to? Put those in the chat too, if any of you have those.
Let's see. Yeah, and one thing that I do want to point out on the SHPO website that is a tool in any landowner's toolbox that we are working on improving right now is something called an inadvertent discovery protocol, which we haven't specifically spoken about, but which is a document that you can develop that's specific to your property. And the form as currently developed kind of imagines a project where an archaeologist has already been contracted, but much of the contact information section and the procedure to follow is still active. And what's super helpful, in my view, is that Oregon SHPO's one, as opposed to a million different kinds of versions of IDPs from federal agencies that I've seen over the years, has a really concise and clear visual guide to the kinds of materials that would be of archaeological concern, the kind of things that are often found in Oregon that would be those 2 artifacts that would be of concern that Chelsea just invoked. So that's a real handy, concise resource to just bookmark or print out and have at hand. And as I said, we're working on some improved versions, and maybe, I don't know if you want, John or Brees, you have anything to add there.
No, thanks for that. I was also just thinking there are some good resources on the Legislative Commission on Indian Services website. There's a position paper by tribes on treatment of Native American human remains. I think we still have them on our website as well, but there are also a couple of videos that were put together with tribes and SHPO and other state agencies relative to those things, state police, that I think are still pretty good and relevant. And so there's all kinds of useful resources on those 2 websites and on tribal websites as well.
Yeah. If I can just kind of anchor this real quick, sorry.
I was just going to say, if any of you folks can email me any of those resources, I can share them with folks afterwards.
Great. I'm seeing the time, but I did want to say that intent and, doing in a good way actually matters. And I think you heard from everybody here today that, wanting to build relationship and work together through some of these complexities, and that makes all of the difference in intent. We all work with each other here, and we're, for Grand Ron at least, the intent is not to stop necessarily. The intent is to pause, get full recognition of what's going on, and understanding, so that the next step in the process can go forward. So yeah, and there are lots of tools out there, and just reach out to the tribes, because if available, or when we can be available, we really like to share good path forward.
Well, thank you
Thank you.
all. We really appreciate your time. And Chelsea, you've been an excellent moderator. You definitely knew how to kind of direct those questions better than I would know. This was definitely like a part A, a part 1, or a part 101. I can see this is a really deep topic. There's a lot to it, the laws and everything, and then everyone has their very individual land that they're dealing with. So maybe there'll be something we can go forward with and get into more. But I'll reach out, and I really appreciate your time, really value it, all the different perspectives, and we will try to follow up with see if I can get you guys some references, folks, in the when I share the link afterwards. So thank you all for your time. Very much appreciate it. And we will hopefully see you in the future.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.